Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Filmmakers adapting popular books face a tough challenge: how to translate a literary story into a cinematic format without facing a storm of criticism from readers. This is especially true for Harry Potter, where many fascinating moments from the original material were left out. Order of the Phoenix, the longest book, ended up being the shortest film. In this video, I want to stand in defense of the filmmakers and examine the scenes that were cut for entirely reasonable reasons.
Enjoy the video!
Number 1. The Marauders' backstory. The third movie was the first to leave out many valuable pieces of information. However, Prisoner of Azkaban is a book packed with events, so the filmmakers had to make some fair sacrifices. Fans were disappointed that the film barely included any information about the Marauders. However, most of this information in the books was delivered through dialogue, leaving the filmmakers with three choices: to show flashbacks, which would require casting additional actors who might not remain consistent in future films, to include lengthy expository conversations, or to limit it to small mentions. The filmmakers wisely chose the third option. Number 2. The Quidditch World Cup. The problem with Quidditch is that filming it is extremely expensive, resource-intensive, and physically demanding for the actors. Every match, even a brief one, would have been a major headache for the production team. This is why many games were cut. Order of the Phoenix didn't include Quidditch at all, even though it played an important role for both Harry and Ron. Goblet of Fire was no exception. We briefly saw Harry and his friends arriving at the match, followed by the aftermath, but the game itself was left off screen. Was this disappointing? Yes, because the final match was thrilling. But was it crucial to the story? Not really. Cutting the match saved screen time for more important scenes. Number 3. The Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare, S.P.E.W. House elves were a common presence in the books, but after Dobby's appearance in Chamber of Secrets, they disappeared from the films until the final installment. The main reason? Complex CGI, which required enormous effort. As a result, audiences never learned about the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare, which Hermione created to free house elves, even against their will. Hermione was inspired to start this movement after she, Harry, and Ron visited the kitchens and discovered that food, surprisingly, didn't just appear out of thin air, it was prepared by hundreds of house elves. This scene wasn't crucial to the plot, and just imagine the cost of animating hundreds of house elves at once. Number 4. Harry's rage. The ending of Order of the Phoenix was devastating. Harry had just found a close father figure in Sirius, only to lose him. The books did an excellent job of showing Harry's heartbreak. Unable to accept what had happened, he lashed out and wrecked Dumbledore's office, while his internal monologue revealed the depth of his grief. The films omitted this moment, and it was a fair decision. The main reason? Viewers cannot see inside Harry's mind, and without an internal monologue, the scene would have played out very differently.
Number 5. All memories about the horcruxes.
In the books, Dumbledore showed Harry far more memories than in the films. Harry saw memories about Voldemort's mother, how the Dark Lord learned about Helga Hufflepuff's cup, and how he returned to Hogwarts to ask for the defense against the dark arts teaching position. None of these scenes were included in the movie, and reasonably so. There were simply too many memories, forcing the filmmakers to choose between including everything, which would have stretched the film and hurt its pacing, or sticking to the most important ones. Number 6. Harry walking into the forest alone. One of the advantages of books is that readers can see inside a character's mind, following their thoughts and emotions in real time. Films, however, rely on actors' performances to convey these internal struggles. After seeing Snape's memories and realizing he had to sacrifice himself, Harry walked alone into the Forbidden Forest to face Voldemort. In the book, he made this journey completely alone, but since the filmmakers couldn't show his thoughts, They had to find another way to convey the scene's meaning. That's why they changed it, so that Harry quickly explains his plan and says goodbye to Hermione and Ron. Number 7, the final battle. In the book, the final battle between Harry and Voldemort took place in front of everyone. The two opponents circled each other in the Great Hall while the crowd watched in breathless anticipation. Harry explained to Voldemort where he had gone wrong and why he was destined to lose. Arrogant as ever, Voldemort attempted one last attack and lost. This scene worked perfectly in the book, but it might not have been as dynamic on screen. In the book, the final battle contained much more dialogue and less action, and if the filmmakers had translated it exactly as written, they risked losing the moment's cinematic impact. Instead, the film staged the battle away from prying eyes, keeping the tension high without unnecessary, for a film, dialogue. Number 8, Dumbledore's funeral. They came from all corners of the wizarding world, wizards in dark robes, giants, centaurs, even mermaids rose from the water to bid farewell to Dumbledore. Hogwarts was silent. Harry stood among the crowd. His chest felt hollow. He couldn't hear the words being spoken. He didn't see the faces around him, only the white coffin covered with a glowing shroud. Fawkes soared into the sky. His mournful cry pierced the hearts of those gathered, a slow, lingering sound filled with pain and sorrow. Lupin clenched his jaw. McGonagall closed her eyes. Hagrid lowered his head onto his shoulder and sobbed like a child. Flames ignited. A white fire rose around the coffin. It didn't burn, didn't destroy. It left Dumbledore intact, sealing him within a stone tomb, a symbol that he would forever remain a part of Hogwarts. This scene never made it into the films. Instead, there was only the gloomy lake shore, Harry, Hermione, Ron, a few words, sadness, but not the scale of the tragedy. Why? The ending of Half-Blood Prince was already heavy. The filmmakers decided it was enough to show Harry's grief. No need to prolong it, no need to go deeper. But the books gave Dumbledore the farewell he deserved. Thousands of wizards coming to Hogwarts showed what he truly was, not just a headmaster, but a symbol of hope. There was no action in this scene, but it was crucial. It showed that the world was changing. The one who held back the darkness was gone. A new era was beginning. The films denied the audience this moment. Instead of a grand farewell, there was only silence. But those who read the books remember. They remember Fawkes disappearing into the sky. They remember the white light enveloping the coffin. And they remember that Dumbledore didn't just die, he remained. Number 9, the original scene of Lavender Brown's attack. Lavender collapsed onto the cold stone floor. Her ears rang. The air smelled of smoke. She tried to get up, but pain shot through her body. Footsteps, slow, heavy, the air filled with an animalistic growl.
Fenrir Greyback.
He loomed over her, his rotten teeth bared in a predatory grin. His eyes gleamed in the dim light. "Such a delicious scent," he hissed. Clawed fingers tightened. In the books, this moment was a nightmare. Greyback didn't just kill, he played. He savoured the hunt. He attacked even without a full moon. There was no mercy in him. Only hunger. But Lavender wasn't a helpless victim. A spell flashed in the air. In the last second, something heavy crashed into Greyback's head with a loud crack. Professor Trelawney stood above, gripping a crystal ball. She was trembling, but she stood her ground. It was she who saved Lavender. This never happened in the films. There, Lavender simply lay motionless on the floor. No fight, no resistance, no chance of rescue. Why? The scene was too intense for a teenage audience. Showing a werewolf hunting its prey was risky. The filmmakers decided to remove it. But in the books, it mattered. Lavender fought back. Trelawney showed bravery. greyback revealed his true monstrous nature. In the films, only a shadow of this remained. Number 10. Draco Malfoy at Hogwarts after the battle. Draco stood apart as Hogwarts crumbled. Duels flared around him, walls collapsed, wounded voices screamed. But he didn't move. He watched as the Death Eaters lost their power, as Voldemort gripped his wand tighter. And he understood. It was over. Narcissa was the first to pull him away. "Come, Draco." Her voice was fragile, like glass. Lucius didn't object. His face had lost all pride, worn with exhaustion. He was no longer Voldemort's favored follower. He was a defeated man. They left, vanishing into the crowd, hoping no one would stop them. In the movie, Draco was shown at the edge of the forest. Voldemort embraced him, as if marking him. The moment was eerie, but it missed the point. In the book, Draco didn't want this. He didn't want war, didn't want to choose sides. He only wanted to survive. When Harry won, the Malfoys were already gone. They weren't in the Great Hall. They didn't celebrate, didn't grieve, didn't justify themselves. No one knew where they had gone. They simply disappeared. In the films, Draco was left as a mere shadow. We never saw what he felt. But in the book, he was terrified. He realized his childhood was over. The family he had once been so proud of had lost everything. Those he had looked down upon had prevailed. One of the most powerful moments in the book was when Draco met Harry's gaze. He said nothing, but in that silence, everything was clear. Shame, fear, defeat. The films left this out. They abandoned Draco in the tower. They reduced him to a scared boy. But his ending wasn't just about fear. It was a moment of realization. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a villain. Just a person who had made mistakes. 19 years later, he stands on platform 934. His son boards the Hogwarts Express. He meets Harry's eyes again. There is no rivalry, no hatred, just silent understanding. But without the Great Hall scene, this ending loses its power. Draco Malfoy remained unfinished in the films. His story ended too soon. Those who read the books know the truth. He chose his family. He survived. But he didn't win. Number 11, the magical protection of the Dursleys' home. Harry never loved the house at 4 Privet Drive. For him, it wasn't a refuge, it was a prison. The Dursleys despised him, forbade any mention of magic, and treated him worse than a household pet. But that house was what protected him. Dumbledore knew Voldemort would return. He knew Harry would be in danger from the moment he was born. That's why he left the boy with Petunia, the only living relative of Lily. As long as he can call this place his home, as long as he returns here at least once a year, he is safe, Dumbledore explained. It was blood magic, the last protection left by Lily. In the books, this was incredibly significant. Voldemort couldn't even come near Privet Drive. Even if he had discovered where Harry lived, he couldn't have harmed him. This explained why Dumbledore left Harry with the Dursleys despite their mistreatment of him. In the films, this detail was barely noticeable. In the Sorcerer's Stone, Dumbledore briefly tells McGonagall that Harry will be safe with his relatives. In Order of the Phoenix, he vaguely mentions protection, but without details. For moviegoers, it just sounded like a general rule. Harry must live with the Dursleys, but in the books it was much deeper. In Order of the Phoenix, Dumbledore explains to Harry, "The day you first entered this house, you received powerful protection. As long as you are here, you are safe." It was more than just a shelter. It was the only barrier between him and Voldemort. When Harry left the house for good, the protection vanished. That's why the Order of the Phoenix rushed to move him. They knew Voldemort would attack as soon as Harry was outside the magical barrier. The film kept this scene but failed to explain why the protection was disappearing at that exact moment. And yet, in the books, even the Dursleys learned the truth. Dumbledore had sent Petunia a letter explaining that despite her hatred of magic, this house was the only thing keeping Harry alive. In Deathly Hallows, the Dursleys didn't just leave. They understood that their home was no longer safe. Dudley even said goodbye to Harry, showing for the first time a hint of compassion. Number 12. The first encounter with the Dark Regime. The halls of the Ministry of Magic were empty. The dark marble floor reflected the torchlight, but the air was thick, like before a storm. Harry walked ahead, gripping his wand. Hermione's breathing was heavy, and Ron stayed close behind. They knew they had entered the enemy's den, but they didn't yet realize just how bad things had become. Then came footsteps, steady, confident. From around the corner they emerged, men in dark robes, their faces exuding cold certainty. Dawlish, Rookwood, Yaxley. Harry recognized them immediately. He had seen them in newspapers, heard their names from Dumbledore, ministry officials, people who were supposed to protect the wizarding world. Now they served Voldemort. "Looks like we have visitors," Dawlish sneered. He had been an Auror, but long ago he had stopped serving the law. He served power. His narrowed eyes studied Harry, as if calculating his chances of escape. Yaxley held her wand at the ready, while Rookwood, a former Death Eater, simply smiled like a man who already knew how this would end. Harry stepped back. Hermione gripped his hand as if trying to hold him in place, but it was too late. "Expelliarmus!" he shouted, and in the next instant spells exploded through the air. Azure flashes sliced through the darkness, reflecting in the marble. Harry lunged forward, but Dawlish was faster. Impedimenta! Harry was thrown back, and only Ron's quick reflexes saved him from crashing into the wall. In the books, this moment was tense, ominous. Harry realized that the Ministry no longer belonged to the wizarding world. It belonged to Voldemort. The people he had seen at official ceremonies were now his enemies. He could no longer trust anyone in this building. This scene never made it into the films. Instead, the trio simply infiltrated the Ministry using Polyjuice Potion, and things went wrong. There was tension, but there was no horror. They saw how the Ministry had changed, but they didn't feel it firsthand. Yet this encounter in the books changed everything. For the first time, Harry, Hermione, and Ron understood just how deep Voldemort's influence ran. This was no longer a secret war. This was an open dictatorship, where the enemy could wear official robes and walk freely through the halls of power. This scene could have been one of the most chilling moments in the movie. It could have made the audience realize that the enemy was everywhere, that the world Harry knew was gone. But it was cut. Number 13. Professor Trelawney's reaction to Dumbledore's death. When Trelawney learned that Dumbledore was dead, she stopped speaking in riddles. Her voice was no longer misty, and her eyes no longer sparkled with imagined visions. She simply sat in her office, clutching an empty sherry bottle. Her hands trembled. She had always been eccentric, amusing, sometimes irritating. But at that moment, there was nothing funny about her. She loved Dumbledore. He had protected her when Severus Snape overheard part of her prophecy. He had given her a job despite the mockery of her colleagues. He had refused to let her be thrown out when Umbridge came to Hogwarts. And now he was gone. In the book, right after Dumbledore's death, Trelawney tried to find comfort in predictions. She muttered that she had seen bad omens, that a plate had cracked that very day. But no one listened. It was her way of coping with grief. But even prophecy couldn't drown out her sorrow. Later, when the Battle of Hogwarts began, Trelawney didn't hide. She stood on the balcony, throwing crystal balls at Death Eaters. One by one, they flew through the air, smashing against the stone floors. "Idiots!" she shouted, hurling another sphere. In that moment, she was no longer just the oddball professor. She was part of the resistance. None of this was in the films. Trelawney remained a background character. We saw her during the feast in the first film. We heard her prophecy in the third. But in the crucial moment when Hogwarts mourned, she was nowhere to be found. Why? Perhaps because the films made her too comical. Her vision of Sirius in Order of the Phoenix was played as a joke. Her interactions with Ron were used for laughs. Maybe the filmmakers thought the audience wouldn't take her seriously in a dramatic moment. But in the books, Trelawney was more than just a caricature. Yes, she could seem ridiculous, but in moments of real danger, her fears were genuine. She wasn't a warrior, but she fought. And Dumbledore was the only one who saw more in her than just a fraud. Number 14, Peeves' departure from Hogwarts. Peeves was as much a part of Hogwarts as the moving staircases or the forbidden corridor on the third floor. The poltergeist, who had existed in the school for centuries, was pure chaos, a whirlwind of mischief. The teachers tolerated him. The students suffered because of him, but without him, Hogwarts wouldn't have been the same. And in the book, his farewell to the school was one of the most striking moments. When the Battle of Hogwarts ended, a victorious song echoed through the ruins of the castle. Peeves soared under the ceiling, tossing inkwells, brooms, and leftover weapons into the air. "Voldy-moldy, what a fright! Voldy's gone! What a sight!" he sang at the top of his lungs. This wasn't just celebration, it was mockery of the dark forces, a symbol that Hogwarts had survived. Peeves had never taken sides. He mocked everyone and everything, but when the Death Eaters arrived, he took it as a personal challenge. In the book, Professor McGonagall even told him, "You are free to wreak havoc, Mr. Peeves." And in sheer delight, he began throwing anything he could find at the invaders. This scene didn't make it into the film. Why? Most likely because Peeves would have required complex CGI. Yes, in Sorcerer's Stone, scenes with him were originally filmed, but they were cut. And after that, the filmmakers decided it was easier to leave him out altogether. But his absence was felt. Without him, there were no scenes where he tried to disrupt exams, where he tormented Filch by threatening to expose his S.P.E.W status, where he ruined school events. He was an anarchist who, despite his antics, was part of the school. When Harry first met him, Peeves threw an inkwell at him. Later, he helped the Weasley twins drive Umbridge to madness. And during the Battle of Hogwarts, he terrified even the bravest Death Eaters. In the books, he was impossible to ignore. Number 15, the full explanation of the Deathly Hallows. The Deathly Hallows, 3 powerful artifacts said to have been created by death itself. In the films, their mythology was presented through a beautifully animated scene, but many important details were left out. In the books, Harry, Ron, and Hermione spent a long time discussing what the Hallows meant and how they could be used. This theme became one of the central mysteries in Deathly Hallows, but the adaptation focused more on horcruxes. Harry first learned about the Hallows from Xenophilius Lovegood. In his house, among many strange objects, he saw a familiar symbol, a triangle with a circle inside and a vertical line down the middle. At first, Harry didn't understand its meaning. Xenophilius explained that the symbol represented 3 objects, the Elder Wand, the Resurrection Stone, and the Invisibility Cloak. But their conversation didn't reveal the true power of the Hallows. The book provided far more detail. Dumbledore had left Harry his first clue, the tales of Beedle the Bard. Within those stories was the tale of the 3 brothers. The eldest asked Death for a wand that would make him invincible. The second asked for a stone that would bring back the dead. The youngest asked for a cloak that would let him hide from death itself. Each of them received their gift, but only the youngest lived to old age, passing the cloak to his son. Ron immediately dismissed the Hallows as a myth. He said the Elder Wand was just a fairy tale. The most powerful wand in history? Possible. Hermione was also skeptical. To her, it was just another magical legend. Only Harry felt that there was something real behind it. But he had to go through a long journey to understand that the Hallows weren't meant to be used as weapons. The films didn't explore this conflict. The Hallows were treated more like a mysterious symbol rather than a serious moral dilemma. One crucial moment that was cut was Harry's realization that he was the true master of all three Hallows. He had inherited the cloak from his father. He had received the stone from Dumbledore's snitch. And he had unknowingly won the Elder Wand from Draco Malfoy when he disarmed him at Malfoy Manor. Without these explanations, the films missed an essential part of the story: Harry's choice. He didn't seek ultimate power, he chose to walk away from it. He understood that chasing the Hallows was just another path to destruction, just as Dumbledore had warned. This deeper meaning was lost in the films, leaving the Hallows as just another piece of magical lore instead of a profound lesson about life, death, and the dangers of obsession. Number 16, the final duel between Harry and Voldemort. The final duel between Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows was more than just a battle of magic. It was a battle of ideologies, of understanding, of truth. In the great hall where the fate of the wizarding world had been decided, two figures faced each other, one a young man with nothing left to fear, and the other a dark lord whose very existence was built upon his terror of mortality. Their confrontation was not just a test of spells and wandwork, but of perception, of the choices that had shaped their lives. As Voldemort stood, wand raised, the remnants of his army scattered or defeated, his red eyes flickered with something close to uncertainty. The power he had once wielded so effortlessly now wavered in his grasp. Across from him, Harry Potter did not attack immediately. He did not need to. Instead, he spoke. "You still don't get it, do you?" His voice carried across the silent hall, cutting through the weight of battle that still lingered in the air. The truth hung between them like an invisible force. The Elder Wand, the most powerful wand in existence, did not truly belong to Voldemort. He had believed, in his arrogance, that by killing Severus Snape he had claimed it. But magic did not answer to murder alone. "I am the true master of the Elder Wand," Harry declared. His words did what spells could not. They cracked the foundation of Voldemort's certainty. The duel began. Voldemort's green curse met Harry's disarming charm. A clash of magic, bright and blinding, sent golden sparks through the ruined hall, but there was no immediate victory. They circled each other, spells flashing, but Harry's words had already begun their work. He was unmaking Voldemort's power with the very thing the Dark Lord had always dismissed: truth.
"You thought killing Snape would make you the master of the wand," Harry continued, his breath heavy, his steps firm. "But the wand answers to power, not murder. The one who took it from Dumbledore wasn't Snape, it was Draco Malfoy." The name sent a ripple through the watching crowd. Draco, standing pale and shaken among the survivors, barely flinched. "And then I took it from him."
For the first time, fear flickered in Voldemort's expression. The Elder Wand trembled in his grip.
"Expelliarmus!" Harry's voice rang out at the exact moment Voldemort screamed, "Avada Kedavra!" The spells met in midair, but this time there was no priori incantatem, no tethered wands holding them in place. This time, Voldemort was not just fighting Harry, he was fighting the will of the Elder Wand itself.
The green light rebounded. Voldemort's own spell turned against him. And then it happened. Not with grandeur, not with the spectacle of a Dark Lord's demise, but with the simplicity of an ending that had been long overdue. Lord Voldemort fell. His body crumpled, lifeless, empty. He did not explode into dust. He did not ascend in a final moment of twisted glory. He was not a god, he was a man, a mortal man, and he had lost. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, those who had feared him saw the truth. He was not some immortal force of destruction. He was just Tom Riddle, a boy who had feared death so much that he had torn his soul apart to escape it. And in the end, that fear had been his undoing. In the films, this moment was lost. The screenwriters had chosen spectacle over meaning, visual drama over narrative weight. The final battle had been reduced to a chase, a series of flying spells, and a dramatic yet hollow ending where Voldemort disintegrated, as though his existence had been something unnatural, even in death. It robbed the story of its greatest triumph, not just that Harry defeated Voldemort, but that he proved him wrong. Because that was always Harry's greatest strength, not his skill with magic, not even his courage, but his ability to understand what Voldemort never could. "Do you know why I survived?" he had asked the Dark Lord in their final moments. "Because my mother's sacrifice still lives in me, because I was willing to die for others." Voldemort had never grasped the power of sacrifice, of love, of trust. He had built his empire on fear and death, and it was that very foundation that had crumbled beneath him. The battle was over, not because Harry had been the stronger wizard, but because he had been the wiser one. He had wielded not just magic, but truth. He had stripped Voldemort of his myths, his illusions, his self-proclaimed destiny. And when it was done, there was no celebration, no moment of triumph. Only the weight of what had been lost and the quiet realization that the war had finally ended. But the film had denied this depth. It had given the audience a moment of action, but it had taken away the essence of what made that final duel truly powerful. Voldemort had not been reduced to dust. He had been reduced to irrelevance. His death had not been grand because he was not grand.
That was the point.
In the Great Hall, as the survivors gathered, they did not see the end of a legend. They saw the truth that had always been there, that the man they had feared for so long had never been anything more than a man, that he had been terrified, desperate, clinging to a power that had never truly been his. Harry did not cheer. He did not raise his wand in victory. He simply stood there, the Elder Wand in his grasp, and knew what had to be done. He did not claim it. He did not seek to wield its power. Instead, he chose to break it, to end the cycle, to ensure that no one else would ever make the same mistake that Voldemort had made. And that, more than any spell, was what truly defeated the Dark Lord. Number 17. How Harry repaired his wand. Harry Potter stood among the ruins of Hogwarts. The battle was over. The Dark Lord was gone. The weight of the moment pressed on his shoulders, but his mind was focused on one thing. Not the bodies of the fallen, not the broken castle, not even the Elder Wand in his grasp, his own wand, the holly and phoenix feather wand that had chosen him at Ollivanders, the wand that had been by his side since the beginning, the wand that had been broken in Malfoy Manor. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the two jagged halves. They felt wrong in his hands, incomplete. A part of him had been missing since it snapped. He had tried to use Hermione's wand, but it had never been the same. The magic did not flow the way it was supposed to. It had felt forced, unnatural. And now, after everything, he had the one thing that could fix it. The Elder Wand, the most powerful wand in the world. Harry looked at it carefully. This wand had belonged to Dumbledore, to Grindelwald, to countless wizards before them. It had been a weapon of power, of destruction. Voldemort had sought it as his ultimate prize, but to Harry it was just a tool, a means to an end. And that end was not control, it was not dominance, it was repair. He knelt on the cold stone floor of the great hall. The light of dawn filtered through the shattered windows. Ron and Hermione watched in silence. They knew what this meant to him. He placed the broken pieces of his wand on the floor before him. The phoenix feather within, the twin to Voldemort's wand, was barely visible between the splintered wood. He took a deep breath, gripping the Elder Wand firmly. Then, softly, he whispered, "Reparo." A golden light enveloped the broken wand. The wood fused, knitting itself back together as though it had never been broken. The warmth of magic rushed through his fingers. The phoenix feather pulsed once, a heartbeat of its own. The wand was whole again. As Harry picked it up, he felt it immediately. The connection, the bond. This was his wand, the one that had been with him through every trial, through every duel, through every moment of danger and triumph. And now it was back where it belonged. Ron let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Blimey," he muttered. It actually worked. Hermione's eyes were wide with amazement. "I don't think I've ever read about someone repairing a wand like that before. The Elder Wand really is something else." But Harry wasn't thinking about the Elder Wand. He was thinking about his own. He ran his fingers along the smooth surface, feeling the familiar grip. He gave it a flick. Sparks erupted from the tip, warm and bright. His magic had returned to him fully. It felt right. It felt like coming home. Then, and only then, did he turn his attention back to the Elder Wand. He had felt its power. He had used it, but he did not want it. He had seen what power did to those who craved it. Voldemort had killed for this wand. Dumbledore had fallen because of it. It had been a source of conflict for centuries, and Harry knew that if he kept it, it would only bring more of the same. He looked at his friends. They understood what he was about to do. Without hesitation, Harry snapped the Elder Wand in two. The wood cracked sharply, the sound echoing through the hall. The most powerful wand in the world, broken and useless. He tossed the pieces away. There would be no more battles fought over it, no more deaths in its name. It was over. In the film, he had broken it without using it, without fixing his wand first. But that wasn't Harry. That wasn't the boy who had spent years protecting others, the boy who valued loyalty and love above all else. In the book, he had used the Elder Wand for one thing, not for revenge, not for power, but for restoration, for healing. That was the difference. Dumbledore had once told him that he believed Harry was a better man than he was, that Harry would not be tempted by power. And now Harry had proven him right. He had held ultimate power in his hands, and he had used it not to rule, but to mend what was broken. The films had cut that moment. They had shown a Harry who discarded the Elder Wand as if it meant nothing, but the truth was more profound. It had meant everything in that moment. It had been a symbol of his victory, not over Voldemort, but over the temptations that had consumed so many before him, over the lure of absolute power. He had made a choice. The first choice of his new life. He had chosen to be himself. Just Harry. He turned back to Ron and Hermione, the weight of the battle finally settling. He was exhausted, but for the first time in years, He was free. He was not the boy who lived. He was not the chosen one. He was just a young man with a wand, ready to step into the world that awaited him. His wand was whole. His path was his own. And for the first time in a long, long time, he smiled. Number 18. Dumbledore and Harry's conversation about the deathly Hallows. The conversation between Dumbledore and Harry at King's Cross was not just a moment of reflection, it was a confession, a moment of reckoning. For the first time, Albus Dumbledore stripped away the grandeur, the mystery, the image of the all-knowing headmaster. He spoke as a man, a flawed, fallible man who had made terrible mistakes and was now standing before Harry, stripped of all illusions. "I resented it, you know," Dumbledore admitted, his voice quiet, almost fragile. "I was gifted, I was brilliant, I wanted more than my fair share of power." His eyes, usually twinkling with knowledge, were now shadowed with regret. This was not the omniscient wizard who had guided Harry for years. This was someone who had once believed he was invincible, only to learn that power was a burden, not a prize. The Elder Wand had called to him. He had yearned for it, just as Grindelwald had. He had not been strong enough to resist. "I sought it, Harry," he confessed, and his hands, usually steady, now trembled as he spoke. "I wanted it for myself." There was no justification, no self-righteous defense, only truth. The great Albus Dumbledore had once been a boy who dreamed of ruling, and that boy had never truly left him. The movies took away this moment. They painted Dumbledore as serene, a wise old mentor, guiding Harry with a knowing smile. But the truth in the books was far more painful, far more human. Dumbledore had not died content. He had died carrying the weight of his failures, and now, in this liminal space between life and death, he finally unburdened himself to the one person who needed to hear it. Gellert Grindelwald had been his friend, his equal, his temptation. Together they had dreamed of a world where wizards ruled. Together they had whispered about the Hallows, the legend of their dominion. "We were going to change the world," Dumbledore admitted, but then Ariana died, and the dream, the power, the hunger, it all turned to ash. "I lost my way, Harry." It was his greatest shame that he had once walked the same path Voldemort now followed, that he had thought himself different from those who sought control. "Power was my weakness, it was my temptation, and I was not strong enough to resist." He had spent his life ensuring no one else suffered from his mistakes. That was why he never took the position of Minister for Magic, why he never sought to rule. He had seen what power did to men like him. The Elder Wand had remained in his grasp, but he had learned the bitter truth. It was not a gift, but a curse, a symbol of his failures. I held it, but it never truly belonged to me. Dumbledore had taken it from Grindelwald, but it had never brought him peace. It was only in his death that he was finally freed from it. The film softened this moment, made it poetic, almost comforting. But in the book, Dumbledore was a man weighed down by his past, speaking to a boy who carried the future. "Do not pity the dead, Harry," he had said. But perhaps in that moment he wished that he had been among them long ago. He had spent decades preparing Harry for this final battle, but this moment was not about battle plans or strategies. This was about honesty. Dumbledore owed him the truth. And the truth was this: he had made mistakes. He had loved the wrong person. He had chased the wrong dreams, and he had paid the price. When he looked at Harry, he did not see a soldier. He did not see a hero. He saw a boy who had already suffered too much, who had been burdened with more than he should have. "I never meant to burden you as I was burdened," he said, and his voice, for the first time, carried something that almost sounded like sorrow. He had used Harry as a pawn, even when he told himself it was for the greater good. And yet Harry did not hate him. He did not turn away in anger. He listened, because he, too, knew what it was to carry a weight too heavy for a child's shoulders. He, too, had been forced to grow up too soon. Dumbledore had spent his life guarding secrets, but here, in the white emptiness of King's Cross, he laid himself bare. The truth. It is a beautiful and terrible thing, and should therefore be treated with great caution. But here there was no caution, only the truth. This was the moment that defined Dumbledore. Not the grand battles, not the wisdom he had given over the years, but this, the admission that he hadn't always been wise, that he had not always been good, that he had craved power and had been weak before it. And that, despite it all, he had tried to do what was right. Harry listened, and when Dumbledore fell silent, he simply nodded. He understood, because he knew now that greatness was not in being perfect, but in acknowledging one's flaws. Dumbledore had spent his life learning that lesson, and now he had passed it on. As Harry stood preparing to leave this place, Dumbledore smiled at him. Not the twinkling, knowing smile he had worn in life, but a small, quiet smile. A smile of relief. He had spoken the truth, and for the first time in a long time, he felt lighter. Number 19, the story of Ariana Dumbledore. Ariana Dumbledore was a ghost of the past, a shadow in Albus Dumbledore's story that few ever truly saw. Her name flickered in whispers, lost between the grandeur of the man her brother became and the secrets he took to his grave. But Ariana was not just a footnote in the life of Albus Dumbledore. She was the wound that never healed, the reason he feared power, the silent force that shaped his every decision. She had been just 6 years old when it happened. A little girl, innocent, fragile, with golden hair that shimmered in the sun. Kendra Dumbledore had always kept her away from prying eyes, knowing that there was something different about her daughter, something dangerous. The magic inside Ariana was not like that of other children. It was raw, untamed, a wildfire in a glass jar. And one day, the wrong people saw it. A group of Muggle boys had been watching from a distance. They had seen Ariana perform a bit of magic, an untrained, accidental flicker of light. Perhaps it was fascination, perhaps it was fear. But they decided they needed to put an end to it. They found her alone and tried to make her stop, tried to hurt her so that she wouldn't be able to use her magic again. No one knows exactly what they did. No one speaks of it. But whatever happened that day broke Ariana in a way that could never be undone. Percival Dumbledore, her father, found her after the attack. He never asked what had been done to her. He never needed to. It was written in her eyes, in the way she no longer spoke, no longer smiled, no longer controlled the magic that now tore through her like a storm. He hunted the boys down, he killed them. And for that he was sent to Azkaban. He never once revealed why he had done it. He knew that if the truth came out, his daughter would be locked away forever. Kendra moved the family to Godric's Hollow, hiding Ariana away from the world. She built walls around her, both physical and emotional, keeping her locked in a house that was meant to protect, but became a prison. There were no friends, no school, no normal childhood, only fear, only secrecy. Aberforth was the only one who truly understood her. He spoke to her gently, sat with her when the magic inside her threatened to tear her apart. When she screamed in the night, it was Aberforth who calmed her, but Albus was different. He loved his sister, but he was young and ambitious, and the weight of responsibility chafed at him like chains around his wrists. When Kendra died, killed in one of Ariana's uncontrolled bursts of magic, Albus's future crumbled before his eyes. He was supposed to be free. He was supposed to become something great. Instead, he was trapped in the house with a sister he did not understand, with a burden he resented. And then Gellert Grindelwald arrived. Gellert was brilliant. He saw the world the way Albus did, not for what it was, but for what it could be. Together they dreamed of a new order, a world where wizards ruled over muggles, where power was no longer something to be feared. The deathly Hallows, the greater good. These ideas consumed them, and in the whirlwind of their plans, Ariana became a shadow once more. Aberforth was the one who finally spoke up. He confronted them, called them out for their arrogance, for their selfishness. He told Albus the truth. While he sat dreaming of conquest, Ariana was wasting away. She needed him, not as a hero, not as a revolutionary, but as a brother. The duel was never meant to happen, but the words turned into shouts. The shouts turned into wands raised in anger. Spells flashed like lightning. Albus, Aberforth, Gellert, and in the middle of it all, Ariana. No one knows whose spell struck her. No one will ever know. She crumpled to the floor, lifeless, in the middle of the home that had once been her cage. The girl who had never been allowed to truly live was now dead. Gellert was the first to run. He did not look back. Aberforth was the first to grieve. He held Ariana in his arms, weeping, screaming at Albus, blaming him, cursing him. And Albus was the first to feel the guilt that would never leave him. From that moment on, he knew power was not for him. Leadership was not for him. He had seen what happened when he reached for it, when he let himself believe he could change the world. He had lost everything. In the years that followed, Albus Dumbledore became the greatest wizard of his time, a man revered for his wisdom and strength. But he never took the seat of Minister for Magic, though it had been offered to him countless times. He never sought to lead, never sought to rule, because in the quiet corners of his mind he still heard Ariana's screams, he still saw her fall. The films brushed over this part of his life, reduced Ariana to a mere mention, a whisper of tragedy. But in the books, she was the key to understanding him. Without Ariana, there was no Dumbledore as the world knew him. She was the reason he feared himself, the reason he never trusted his own hands with power. Harry Potter never knew the full truth until it was too late. He only saw glimpses, fragments of the man behind the legend. And when he finally stood before the portrait of Ariana in the Hog's Head, when Aberforth spat the truth at him in anger, Harry understood what few ever did. The great Albus Dumbledore was not invincible, he was not untouchable, he was, in the end, just a man who had lost too much. In the Deathly Hallows, Albus's confession came in a whisper, a ghost of a secret he had carried for a lifetime. He had once craved power, once dreamed of ruling, and in doing so he had destroyed the only thing that truly mattered. "I had learned that I was not to be trusted with power," he admitted to Harry in the strange white limbo between life and death. "It was the price of my shame."
Ariana Dumbledore was the lesson he could never forget, the sister he had failed, the life he could never make right.
And so he spent the rest of his years trying to atone, not with words, not with apologies, but with actions. He guided Harry not as a general leading a soldier, but as a teacher shaping a student. He never told Harry everything. He never gave him all the answers, because power, he knew, was best wielded by those who never sought it. In the end, when Harry stood before the Elder Wand, the last of the deathly Hallows in his grasp, he made the choice Dumbledore had once failed to make. He broke it.
Ariana's story did not appear in the films the way it should have, but her presence lingered in every choice Dumbledore made, in every sacrifice, in every step he took away from power and towards something greater. Love. Redemption. The quiet hope that perhaps in the end, it is not strength that defines a person, but the ability to recognize when to let it go. Number 20, Dudley's farewell scene with Harry.
The morning was unusually silent as the Dursleys prepared to leave. It was the last time they would stand in the house at 4 Privet Drive, a house that had been their fortress, their carefully maintained sanctuary from the world they didn't understand. And yet for Harry, it had always been something else entirely, a prison, a place where he was tolerated rather than loved, where he had spent years learning to be invisible. He should have been relieved to see them go. But instead he felt something unexpected, a strange sense of finality, a quiet weight settling in his chest. The door was open, the car waiting in the driveway. Uncle Vernon was already behind the wheel, his hands gripping it with unnecessary force, as if it were the only thing tethering him to reality. Petunia stood nearby, clutching her handbag as though afraid it might be snatched away. Dudley lingered on the doorstep, his bulky frame casting a long shadow in the morning light. Harry had expected them to leave without a word. That was the Dursley way, silence, avoidance, pretending things hadn't happened, pretending he hadn't been there all those years, pretending he wasn't leaving to walk straight into war. He had steeled himself for that indifference. He had seen it too many times to expect anything else. And then Dudley hesitated. For a moment he simply stood there, looking at Harry in a way he never had before. His piggy eyes, once so full of cruelty and childish spite, now held something unfamiliar. There was no sneer, no mocking glint of superiority. If anything, Dudley looked uncertain. Harry waited, unsure what to expect. Then, in a voice that was quieter than usual, almost gruff, Dudley said, "I don't think you're a waste of space." It was such a simple sentence, so plain, so stripped of the grand declarations and dramatic reconciliations that fiction might have dictated. And yet it hit Harry like a physical blow. For years, the words of the Dursleys had carved into him, shaping the way he saw himself in their world. They had called him a freak, an ungrateful brat, an unwanted burden. He had grown up believing that nothing he did would ever be enough to change that. But this small acknowledgement was something he had never imagined hearing. Harry blinked, momentarily thrown. He searched Dudley's face, looking for some kind of mockery, waiting for a punchline. But there was none. Dudley had meant it. A memory surfaced unbidden. That night in the alley, the Dementors closing in, the cold tightening like a noose around them both. Dudley had been helpless, collapsing under the weight of his own worst fears. And Harry, despite everything, had saved him.
Had that been the moment something shifted?
Dudley wasn't a boy anymore. He had grown in ways that weren't just physical. Maybe it had taken a brush with real terror, a night when all the petty cruelties of childhood had faded into irrelevance. Maybe he had spent the months since then thinking about what Harry had done for him, about what that had meant. Maybe, for the first time, he had started to see Harry not as the unwanted cousin, but as someone who had always been there, standing at the edges of his life. Harry didn't know what to say. He had never been good with words, never been sure how to react to kindness, especially from people who had spent years withholding it. He could feel something welling up in his chest, gratitude, confusion, something that made his throat feel tight. "Thanks," he managed at last. Dudley nodded, as if that was all he had wanted to hear. Petunia was watching them. Her face was unreadable, her thin lips pressed tightly together. There was something almost expectant in her eyes, as if she wanted to say something too. But whatever war raged inside her, whatever words hovered on the tip of her tongue, she swallowed them back. She turned and walked toward the car. Dudley followed her, but just before getting in, he looked back once more. It was the smallest of gestures, a moment so fleeting it might have been imagined. And yet it lingered. Harry watched them go, the car pulling out of the driveway, the house standing empty behind him. For the first time, it wasn't just the end of something bitter. It was something else, too. Something unfinished, but not broken beyond repair. Dudley had changed, and somehow that mattered. Number 21, Voldemort leaving with Snape's body. Voldemort did not leave Severus Snape's body behind. He took it with him. This is one of the eerie details from the books that the films completely erased. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, when Voldemort slit Snape's throat and left him to bleed out under Nagini's deadly fangs, he did not simply walk away. He left, silent and composed, carrying the body of the man he had just murdered. It was not an act of mercy. It was not respect. It was something far darker, an erasure, a cold, calculated removal, as if Severus Snape had never existed at all. It is a chilling image. The Dark Lord, his pale hands gripping the lifeless form of his former servant, disappearing into the shadows. Snape had spent years operating in the dark, manipulating, sacrificing, betraying, and being betrayed. And in the end, he was swallowed by it. His death was not honored, nor was it acknowledged. Voldemort ensured that even in death, Snape remained unseen, unaccounted for. In the film adaptation, Snape's death is framed differently. He is left behind, collapsed against the wooden walls of the boathouse, eyes glazed over, abandoned. It is a poignant image, but it does not carry the same weight. In the books, Voldemort's decision to remove the body adds another layer of terror. It is a message, a brutal reminder that no one mattered to him, not the followers who had devoted their lives to his cause, not the man who had played a key role in his return, not even the wizard whose loyalty he had believed unquestionable until the very moment he decided he no longer needed him. He is his own worst enemy, Dumbledore once said of Voldemort. And indeed, his paranoia dictated everything he did. The moment he suspected Snape had not truly been his, he disposed of him. No words, no hesitation. It was a lesson Voldemort had learned long ago. Eliminate all possible threats, erase all potential obstacles, and never leave behind a trace. Snape was no longer useful. His knowledge had been drained, his purpose exhausted, his body, a mere inconvenience, had to be dealt with. What did Voldemort do with him? The question lingers. He never acknowledges Snape's body again. It is never found, never mentioned. In the chaos that follows the battle, the final confrontation, the collapse of Voldemort's reign, Snape's disappearance becomes one of the many shadows in the war's aftermath. For Harry, for those who fought alongside him, there is no closure. They find the truth, but not the man himself. Harry steps into the headmaster's office with Snape's memories clutched in his hands. He pours them into the pensieve, watches a life unfold, a life filled with love, pain, sacrifice, and yet when he emerges there is nobody to mourn, no grave to visit. Snape exists now only in memory. It is as though he was never there. Perhaps that is the cruelest part of it all. Snape had spent his life on the periphery, standing in the shadows of others, James Potter, Lily, Voldemort, Dumbledore. He had played his role, manipulated events, hidden his true self beneath layers of deception, and in the end he vanished just as he had lived, in silence, in secrecy. It is an unsettling realization. In stripping Snape of even the dignity of a death witness, Voldemort ensured his absence was absolute. A man who had already sacrificed everything was robbed of even the basic recognition of loss. The only trace left behind were his memories, fragile, fleeting echoes of a truth that only Harry would ever fully understand. Would Snape have cared? Would he have fought for a different ending? It is impossible to say. He had never sought gratitude, never asked for recognition. Perhaps, in the quiet erasure of his existence, there was a twisted kind of justice, a final severance from the war he had spent decades fighting, from the men he had served and deceived. Yet, even in death, he was not truly free. His secrets were laid bare. His love for Lily, his heartbreak, his lifelong struggle, it was all exposed in those silent memories. And Harry, standing alone in that moment, saw the truth. Snape had not been a hero, nor a villain. He had been a man trapped between the two, a pawn in games he had never truly controlled, a spy who had lived too many lies to find a way out. And so, when the war ended, when the dust settled, Snape's absence became yet another question with no answer. His body was never recovered. His name, though redeemed in Harry's eyes, remained one that many would curse. And Voldemort, the one who had taken him, never looked back. This moment in the book is powerful precisely because of that disappearance. Snape does not get a funeral. He does not get a farewell. He is gone, taken by the very force he had once served, discarded like all the others who had outlived their usefulness to the Dark Lord. Voldemort's cruelty is at its most terrifying here. There is a clinical efficiency to his actions. He does not rage. He does not revel in Snape's death. He simply removes him as one would sweep away the remnants of a broken chess piece. Cold, unfeeling, absolute. It is a fate worse than death. To die is one thing. To be erased, to be forgotten, to leave no trace, that is something else entirely. And for a man who had lived in the shadows, who had spent a lifetime hiding behind masks, there was perhaps no ending more fitting or more tragic. In the final moments of battle, Harry understands, Snape had been one of the many casualties of Voldemort's reign, but he had been more than that. He had been a key player, a crucial force in the war's outcome. He had saved lives. He had made impossible choices, and yet, in the end, he had been discarded just like the others. Voldemort's final cruelty was not just in taking Snape's life, it was in making sure that even in death he remained invisible. A man who had spent years working in silence was condemned to vanish without a sound.
It is a detail the film stripped away, but in the books it lingers, a chilling reminder of what Voldemort truly was, a force of destruction, a creature incapable of attachment, of respect, of understanding anything beyond his own power.
He did not just kill Snape. He made sure the world forgot him, and in doing so he left behind one of the most haunting absences in the entire series. Number 22, the fate of Pettigrew. Peter Pettigrew's fate in the Harry Potter books is one of poetic justice, a moment of chilling consequence that the films erased without explanation. His story did not simply fade away into the background. He met an end that was both brutal and fitting. The silver hand Voldemort gave him was not a gift. It was a leash, a weapon, and ultimately an executioner. Pettigrew had spent years betraying trust, switching sides, and seeking only his own survival. But magic does not forget, and Voldemort, least of all, does not forgive. When Harry and Ron were captured and thrown into the cellar of Malfoy Manor, the situation seemed hopeless. The Malfoys had them. Bellatrix Lestrange was above, wild with paranoia and cruelty. And Pettigrew, Wormtail, was the one left to guard them. The same man who had once been their parents' closest friend, the same man who had betrayed James and Lily to Voldemort, the same man who had framed Sirius Black. Pettigrew was nothing if not consistent in one thing. He chose self-preservation over loyalty. He was pathetic, cowardly, and driven by fear. But fear, it seemed, was no longer enough to protect him. Harry saw him first. The glint of his silver hand, the shadow of the man he had once spared. Pettigrew had been there in the shrieking shack years ago, snivelling and desperate, pleading for his life. He had begged Harry, Ron, and Hermione to let him go, promising anything to be free. And in that moment, Harry had hesitated. He had told Sirius and Remus Lupin not to kill him. "I don't think my dad would have wanted his best friends to become killers, just for you." A single act of mercy, one that Pettigrew had never deserved. And yet, it had saved him.
Now, in the Malfoy dungeons, Harry used that against him. "You owe me," Harry said.
For just a moment, Pettigrew stopped. The words hit him like a curse. His breath caught. His watery eyes, always darting about for escape, seemed to see something else, a memory, a crack in the shield of his endless cowardice. Harry had spared him once. He owed Harry his life. His grip on Harry loosened. A flicker of humanity, a brief, impossible moment of conscience, had slipped through his fear. Pettigrew, who had betrayed everyone who had ever trusted him, who had always served power and never friendship, hesitated. And that was his mistake. Because the hand Voldemort had given him, an extension of the Dark Lord's will, did not hesitate. It moved of its own accord. The moment Pettigrew showed weakness, the moment he disobeyed even slightly, it struck. The silver fingers, once gleaming and smooth, tightened around his throat. Pettigrew's eyes widened. He clawed at it with his other hand, but there was no escaping it. His breath came in choked gasps, his feet scrambling against the cold stone floor. His own hand, his own, was killing him. Harry and Ron watched in stunned horror. There was nothing they could do, nothing anyone could do. Pettigrew had lived by betrayal, and now he was dying by it. The magic Voldemort had gifted him was not a reward but a sentence, a trap that had been waiting for him all along. He struggled. His eyes bulged, his lips turned blue, and then with a final desperate convulsion, he collapsed. His silver hand fell limp, his body crumpled. Silence filled the dungeon. It was over. Pettigrew had died exactly as he had lived, caught between fear and treachery, grasping at survival, only to find that there was no escape left. The man who had handed the Potters to Voldemort, who had framed Sirius, who had spent years hiding as a rat to avoid consequences, had met the cruelest end of all. He had been killed by the very thing he had believed would protect him. The films erased this, they erased him. Wormtail simply vanished from the story as if he had never mattered. But his death in the books was a reckoning. It was justice, twisted and dark, but justice nonetheless. It was proof that even the weakest of men, even the most cowardly, still face the weight of their choices. Pettigrew's fate was not a grand battle, not a final moment of redemption, not a sacrifice for the greater good. It was something far smaller, but far more haunting. A moment of hesitation, a whisper of guilt, and a punishment that came not from heroes nor from enemies, but from the very magic that had once granted him power. He was a servant until the end, but Voldemort's servants do not get mercy.
Number 23. Lupin and Tonks' reaction to the birth of their son.
Remus Lupin never thought he would have a family. He had accepted long ago that his life would be one of solitude. Werewolves weren't meant to be husbands, let alone fathers. The world had made that clear to him since childhood. He had seen the fear in people's eyes, the way they recoiled at the very mention of his condition. Even among his closest friends, even among the Marauders, he had once felt that unspoken truth. He was different, he was dangerous, and dangerous men shouldn't dream of love. But then there was Nymphadora Tonks. She was everything he was not, young, vibrant, unafraid. She had made a choice to love him despite his protests, despite his insistence that she deserved better. She had married him against his fears, had chosen a life of hardship and uncertainty just to be with him. And now, against all odds, she had given him something even greater. A son. The news should have filled him with joy. And it did, somewhere beneath the crushing weight of his fear. But as he sat in the quiet of Shell Cottage, staring at the hands that had done so much harm in his life, all he could think about was his own father's face. Lyle Lupin had tried to protect him, had tried to shield his only son from the cruelty of the world. But he had failed. He had been unable to stop Fenrir Greyback from sinking his teeth into his child, had been unable to give him a life free of shame. Lupin felt that same failure deep in his bones. What if his son suffered because of him? What if the world looked at little Edward Remus Lupin, Teddy, as Tonks had already started calling him with an affectionate grin, and saw only the son of a monster? What if he grew up ashamed of the man who had given him life? These thoughts consumed him. He could hardly eat, could barely meet Tonks's gaze as she lay in bed, exhausted but glowing, their newborn son cradled in her arms. She didn't seem to share his fears, or if she did, she hid them well. "Look at him, Remus," she murmured, brushing a hand over the soft, downy hair, already showing signs of changing colour. He's perfect. Lupin wanted to believe it. He wanted to silence the voice in his head that whispered warnings of tragedy and loss. But he was already envisioning the life ahead of his son, of doors slammed in his face, of whispered words behind his back, of a world that refused to see him as anything other than tainted. And so in his moment of deepest weakness he fled. He had gone to find Harry Potter. Harry, who had lost his own parents to war, who had grown up without a father to guide him. Harry, who Lupin thought might understand what he could not, the unbearable weight of fatherhood. But when he had offered to join Harry's mission, when he had confessed that he wanted to leave, Harry had not given him the understanding he had expected. "You're scared," Harry had said, eyes burning with disbelief. "So what? Would you have wanted your father to leave you just because the world is dangerous?" The words struck Lupin like a physical blow. He had always known Harry was brave, but in that moment he saw something more. He saw James in his godson's face. He saw Lily's fire in his voice. And he saw the raw, undeniable truth in what he was saying.
"You should be with your wife," Harry had continued, "and you should be with your son."
Lupin had no answer. His breath had caught in his throat, his hands had curled into fists at his sides, but Harry wasn't finished. "I'd be honored to be godfather to your child," he had added, softer now, as if he, too, was realizing the weight of those words. Godfather. It was a simple title, but it held history. James had chosen Sirius, and now he was choosing Harry. The boy he had once taught in a dimly lit classroom, the boy who had seen the worst of him and still trusted him, the boy who had just reminded him of what it truly meant to be a father. Lupin had left that conversation shaken, but he had also left it with something he hadn't felt in years, purpose. He returned to Tonks that night, slipping into their home as quietly as the wolf he feared. She was awake, feeding their son, humming softly under her breath. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, and for the first time since the birth, he didn't see anger or disappointment in her face, just relief.
"You came back," she whispered.
He knelt beside the bed, his hands reaching for hers, his fingers brushing against the tiny bundle between them. Teddy gurgled in his sleep, his small mouth forming an unconscious smile. And for the first time, Lupin felt something stronger than his fear. He felt love. It was not the easy, effortless kind of love he had seen in books or dreamed of as a child. It was fierce, desperate. It was the kind of love that terrified him because it meant he had something to lose. But he would not lose this, not again, not to his own fear. Tonks must have seen the change in his eyes, because she said nothing, only leaned against him, her exhaustion finally giving way to sleep. And as Lupin held his son in his arms for the first time, he realized something else. Teddy did not look at him with fear. Teddy did not see a monster. He did not see a man unworthy of fatherhood. He simply was warm, trusting, small. Lupin pressed a kiss to his son's forehead, his lips trembling against the soft skin. "I will make you proud," he murmured. It was both a promise and a prayer. And yet fate was cruel. The Battle of Hogwarts loomed closer each day. When the call came, Lupin knew he could not stay behind. He had something to fight for now. He had always fought for a world in which people like him, like Teddy, could live freely. But now it was personal. He was not just fighting for an abstract idea of justice. He was fighting for his son's future. He had made Harry his godfather, but he had no intention of letting Teddy grow up an orphan. But the war does not care for promises, does not wait for fathers to return home. In the great hall, under the cold stone ceiling, Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks lay side by side. Their hands, though still, were inches apart, as if reaching for each other even in death. Their bodies bore the marks of battle, but their faces were peaceful. There was no fear in them any more, no doubt. They had fought, and they had lost. But they had lived, and in the arms of his grandmother, Teddy Lupin would grow, would laugh, would learn the stories of the parents who had loved him so fiercely. He would know that his father had once been afraid, but that he had overcome that fear, that he had returned, that he had fought not just for a better world, but for him. And one day, when Teddy was old enough, someone, perhaps Harry, perhaps Andromeda, would tell him the story of how his father had once asked the boy who lived to be his godfather, and they would tell him what Harry had said in response.
"I'd be honored."
Number 25, Voldemort's last words. Voldemort's final moment was not the grand spectacle the films portrayed. He did not disintegrate into dust, nor did he unleash a final curse upon the world. He died as any other mortal would, his body collapsing to the ground, lifeless, ordinary, stripped of all the illusions of power he had once wielded. For a man who had spent his life fearing death more than anything else, the end came swiftly, unceremoniously. And his last words, cut short, unfinished, were not the commanding incantation of a dark sorcerer, but the desperate breath of a man who had lost everything. He had spent decades shaping his own legend, turning himself into a creature beyond death. He was Tom Riddle no longer. He was Lord Voldemort, the name spoken in hushed tones, feared, revered. He had split his soul, created his horcruxes, bent magic itself to his will in a futile attempt to escape the fate that awaited all men. And yet when death finally came for him, it came as it always had, indifferent, inevitable. His magic failed him, his horcruxes were gone, and in the end, he was just another body on the floor, another life extinguished.
Av! The word hung in the air, an unfinished spell. It was to be the killing curse, the same curse he had used to end so many lives before. He had wanted to destroy Harry, to finally erase the boy who had defied him since infancy. But death was faster than he was. The magic that had been his weapon, his shield, his entire existence, was gone before he could complete the incantation. And so his last breath was not a victorious declaration, nor a final attempt at defiance. It was simply the sound of a man realizing too late that he was going to die.
Harry stood among the crowd, watching as the body of the Dark Lord lay motionless, empty. There was no ceremony, no divine intervention, no tragic poetry in Voldemort's end. He had spent his entire life running from death, and yet it had taken him with the same quiet certainty as it did everyone else. The fearsome sorcerer, the self-proclaimed immortal, was nothing more than a corpse now. And in that moment, something changed. The world did not seem darker in his absence. It did not tremble at his fall. It simply moved on. The films transformed this moment into a cinematic spectacle, with Voldemort disintegrating into ashes, his essence scattered into the wind as if the universe itself was erasing him. But that was never how it happened in the books. In the books, Voldemort's death was final, human. There was no grand departure, no mythical end. His body remained tangible, undeniable. His followers could no longer pretend he was something beyond mortal understanding. He was dead, and no amount of dark magic could change that. There was a cruel irony in the way he died. He had built his entire empire on the idea that he was superior to all, above the natural order. He was the heir of Slytherin, the master of death, the greatest sorcerer the world had ever seen. But in the end, he died just like any other man. There was no spectacle to mark his passing, no grandeur to his downfall. His death was not noble, nor was it honorable. It was empty. For years he had tried to conquer death, believing that to die was the ultimate failure, and yet, when death finally claimed him, it did so with effortless precision, unraveling his magic, his plans, his very being. No army stood in his defense. No spell could bring him back. His entire existence had been dedicated to proving that he was beyond the reach of mortality, and yet here he was, lifeless, still, silent. Those who had feared him, who had worshipped him, who had built their lives around his power, were forced to confront a reality they had never imagined. Their Dark Lord was gone. He had not become a god. He had not risen beyond the veil. He had simply ceased to be. And with his death, the fear he had once commanded began to dissipate. He was no longer an idea, a myth, an unstoppable force. He was just a man who had reached the end of his story. The room was silent. The echoes of battle had faded. The tension evaporated. People looked at his body expecting something more, some final act, some terrifying resurgence. But there was nothing. Voldemort had always been the embodiment of terror, the nightmare that haunted the wizarding world. And now he was just another casualty of war, another name to be written in history. His power had not saved him. His ambition had not protected him. Death had taken him as easily as it took anyone else. Even those who had followed him, who had pledged their lives to his cause, could see the truth now. Bellatrix Lestrange was dead. Lucius Malfoy had fled. The Death Eaters had lost their leader, and without him, they were nothing. He had promised them a new world, a kingdom ruled by purebloods, an age of domination and power. But in the end, all he had given them was defeat. His name, once spoken in fear, would now be remembered with shame. The irony was overwhelming. He had mocked Dumbledore's faith in love, in humanity, in sacrifice. He had believed himself beyond such weaknesses, but, in the end, It was those very things that had brought him down. He had underestimated the power of love, the strength of friendship, the resilience of those he sought to oppress. And so he fell, not in glory, not in wrath, but in silence, in failure. His last moment was one of desperation. He had still believed, even in his final breath, that he could win, that he could kill, dominate, erase the one obstacle that had always stood in his way. But there was no victory for him. The spell never came. He never had the chance to unleash his final curse. Death had come too quickly. He had spent a lifetime fearing it, and when it arrived, it showed no mercy. Harry did not gloat. He did not revel in the victory. He simply stood, watching as Voldemort lay motionless. The war was over, the world had changed, and yet, in that moment, there was no joy, no celebration. There was only the undeniable truth that death had come for the Dark Lord, as it did for all men. He had not been spared, he had not been chosen, he had not been saved by his own magic. He had simply died. Those who had suffered under his reign, Neville, Luna, Ginny, the countless students at Hogwarts, the families torn apart by his terror, looked upon his body with quiet disbelief. He had seemed invincible, eternal, and yet here he was as lifeless as any other victim of war. His death did not bring back the fallen, did not erase the scars he had left upon the world. But it did prove one thing. He was never more than a man. The fear he had instilled in so many, the legend he had built around himself, the myths of his immortality, all of it crumbled in an instant. He had sought to control death, but death had controlled him. He had sought to rewrite the laws of magic, but magic had abandoned him in the end. The boy he had tried to kill had survived, and he had not. For Harry, this moment was not about vengeance, it was about closure. Voldemort had haunted his life, shaped his destiny, dictated every major event of his childhood. And now, finally, that shadow was gone. There would be no return, no resurgence. He would never hear that voice again, never see that pale, snake-like face staring back at him with malice. He had won, not through hatred, not through power, but through resilience, through love, through the simple truth that he had never let fear define him. And so the body remained. No different from any other corpse, no different from the countless lives Voldemort had taken. He had wanted to be remembered, to be feared for eternity. But the only thing left of him now was a hollow shell. He had feared death more than anything, and in the end it had come for him just the same. There was no escaping it. No matter how much power he had, no matter how many lives he had stolen, no matter how much he had sacrificed, he had never been able to change one simple fact. Everyone dies, and so he did. Number 26, Harry's conversation with Dumbledore's portrait. Harry stood in the headmaster's office, his heart still hammering in his chest. The battle was over. The halls of Hogwarts were filled with the whispers of the living and the silence of the fallen. Outside, the castle bore the wounds of war, its towers cracked, its walls scorched. But in this room, time seemed untouched. The portraits of past headmasters dozed or watched him with quiet curiosity. And there, high above the desk, was the portrait of Albus Dumbledore. Harry's breath caught as he met those familiar twinkling blue eyes. They gazed at him with warmth, with a quiet pride, as though Dumbledore had been waiting for this moment. The old headmaster smiled, his half-moon spectacles slipping slightly down his nose, just as they had in life. "Professor," Harry said, his voice hoarse. The weight of the past year pressed down on him, but here, in this office, he felt like a student again. I wanted to talk to you. Dumbledore's portrait chuckled softly. And I have been hoping you would. Harry swallowed. He had so many questions, but only one mattered right now. His hand tightened around the Elder Wand, its smooth wood humming with quiet power. The wand that had once belonged to Dumbledore, that had passed to Draco Malfoy, and then, by a twist of fate, to Harry himself.
"The Elder Wand," Harry said at last. "I can't keep it."
Dumbledore's eyes glimmered with understanding. "Ah, of course! You are wiser than most wizards twice your age, Harry. Tell me, what do you intend to do?" Harry hesitated. He had thought about this, had turned the idea over in his mind ever since he had seen Dumbledore's body lying still in the moonlight on the astronomy tower. This wand had caused too much destruction. Too many had died in its pursuit. He couldn't risk it falling into the wrong hands again. "I'm going to put it back," he said, "in your tomb. If I die a natural death, the power will be broken, won't it?" Dumbledore's portrait beamed. Indeed, a most sensible choice. A lump formed in Harry's throat. He could hear the admiration in Dumbledore's voice, but there was something else too. Regret. Harry exhaled sharply. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "About the Hallows, about Snape, about everything." The twinkle in Dumbledore's eyes dimmed for the first time. He leaned forward slightly, his expression sad but unafraid. "Because I was afraid, my dear boy. Afraid that you would make the same mistakes I did. That you would seek power rather than peace." Harry shook his head. "I nearly died because of what I didn't know." Dumbledore nodded solemnly. "And yet you lived because of who you are." Silence stretched between them. Harry thought about the journey that had brought him here, the horcruxes, the sacrifices, the knowledge that he himself had been a part of Voldemort's soul. He had walked into the Forbidden Forest ready to die, and yet he had survived. "Professor," he said after a long pause, "was it you who sent me back, after King's Cross?" Dumbledore's portrait smiled faintly. "You made the choice, Harry. I merely hoped you would." Harry let out a shaky breath. "I saw you there, but it wasn't really you, was it? A reflection, perhaps, a part of your heart that still needed guidance." Harry studied him. There was so much he wanted to say, so much he would never get the chance to ask. But in that moment, he realized something. Dumbledore had never truly been the perfect, all-knowing figure he had once believed him to be. He had been flawed. He had made mistakes, but he had loved Harry in his own way. And in the end, he had trusted him to do what was right. Harry ran a hand through his messy hair and looked down at the Elder Wand one last time. "I suppose this is goodbye, then?" Dumbledore nodded. "Yes, I suppose it is." Harry turned to leave, but hesitated at the door. He looked back at the portrait one more time. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. Dumbledore's smile deepened. "You're most welcome, dear boy." And with that, Harry stepped out of the office, the weight on his shoulders lighter than it had been in years. Number 27, the true role of Crabbe and Goyle in the Battle of Hogwarts. Draco Malfoy, Vincent Crabbe, and Gregory Goyle had always been inseparable. Since their first year at Hogwarts, the trio moved as one, with Malfoy leading and the other two serving as his ever-present muscle. But when the Battle of Hogwarts erupted, the illusion of their unity shattered. Crabbe and Goyle were no longer simple lackeys, content with following Draco's every word. They had grown, changed, and in Crabbe's case, become something far more dangerous than a school bully. The final moments of Crabbe's life, as described in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, were not just a tragic accident. They were a symbol of self-inflicted destruction, a warning about the reckless pursuit of power. The scene unfolded in the Room of Requirement, a space that reflected the desires of those who entered. In this moment, it had transformed into a chaotic maze of hidden artifacts and abandoned treasures. Draco, Crabbe and Goyle had chased Harry Potter and his friends into this labyrinth, thinking they would finally capture him, perhaps even kill him. But what should have been a simple ambush quickly spiraled out of control. When Crabbe decided to wield a magic far beyond his understanding, it was not just Harry, Ron, and Hermione who were in danger. He had doomed them all. The spell was fiend fire, an ancient and near uncontrollable force, a flame that devoured everything in its path, including magic itself. It was not just an ordinary fire, it was sentient, hungry, and relentless. Once unleashed, it twisted into shapes of gigantic beasts, roaring serpents, and monstrous forms that pursued anything living. "Crabbe, you idiot!" Draco had shouted, realizing too late the magnitude of what his so-called friend had done. But Crabbe did not listen. He stood frozen, caught between the thrill of his own power and the terror of what he had released. In the chaos that followed, everything was turned to ruin. The enchanted room, which had safeguarded countless hidden objects over the centuries, was reduced to an inferno. The towering shelves collapsed as the fire spread, consuming centuries of forgotten history. Harry, Ron, and Hermione scrambled to escape, dodging flames that seemed to have a mind of their own. Malfoy, once so composed and arrogant, now clutched at anything for survival. His voice cracked with fear. Goyle had already fallen unconscious, rendered useless in the chaos, and Crabbe was beyond saving. Harry, who had spent years fighting against dark forces, recognized the danger instantly. Fiend fire was not something that could be extinguished, not by water, not by spells. It was a consuming force, designed to annihilate anything in its wake. And Crabbe, who had cast it with reckless confidence, had no idea how to control it. The fire turned on him like a living predator, its claws of flame reaching out, pulling him into its depths.
"Crabbe!" Draco shouted again, but it was too late. The moment was over in a flash, a scream, a flare of light, and then nothing. Crabbe was gone.
It was not an act of heroism or sacrifice. It was not a noble death in battle. Crabbe had died by his own hand, a victim of his own arrogance. He had played with power that was far beyond him, thinking himself strong enough to wield it. But magic, especially dark magic, does not bend to the will of fools. It had consumed him just as easily as it consumed the centuries of forgotten relics in the room. What made this moment so significant was not just the spectacle of destruction, but what it represented. Throughout the series, Crabbe had been nothing more than a brute, a background character whose presence served to bolster Draco's authority. But in this final act, he stepped beyond his role as a mere lackey. He was not just Draco's follower. He was someone who had taken his own path, even if that path led directly into the abyss. Unlike Draco, who had spent the year hesitating, doubting and fearing his future, Crabbe had embraced the ideology of the Death Eaters with terrifying enthusiasm. He was no longer the simple-minded thug who laughed at Draco's jokes. He was willing to kill. J.K. Rowling did not write this scene as a mere spectacle. She used it to illustrate a fundamental truth about power. Those who seek it recklessly, who treat it as a game, will often become its first victims. Crabbe, blinded by his own aggression, unleashed something that even the greatest wizards feared. His death was not mourned. It was not marked by sorrow. It was swift, merciless, and final. He was a casualty not of war, but of his own making. In contrast, Draco Malfoy survived. He had begun the battle with the same arrogance he had always carried, but by the end of it he was not the same person. He had seen his friend die, seen how little his name and wealth protected him. He had nearly died himself, saved at the last second, not by his own skill, but by Harry Potter, his lifelong enemy. There was something poetic in that moment, something tragic. The Malfoy name, once so powerful, meant nothing in the face of fire. And yet the films did not honor this moment. Instead, the scene was rewritten. Crabbe's role was given to Goyle, an awkward substitution that stripped the moment of its deeper meaning. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2, it was Goyle who cast the fire, and it was Goyle who perished in the flames. The reasoning was simple. The actor who played Crabbe, Jamie Waylett, had been unable to participate due to legal troubles. But by replacing Crabbe with Goyle, the film lost something essential. It turned a moment of thematic weight into a simple set piece of destruction. Goyle's death lacked the same significance. Unlike Crabbe, he had never been the violent one. He had never sought power the way Crabbe had. His death felt arbitrary, an unfortunate casualty rather than the result of his own choices. The weight of self-inflicted destruction was gone. The warning about recklessly wielding dark magic was softened. The fire remained, but its meaning was lost. Had the film followed the book's version, the audience would have seen the true consequences of hatred and unchecked aggression. They would have seen a boy who had spent years as a bully who had finally taken his own initiative, only to be undone by his own actions. Instead, the scene became just another moment of spectacle, another explosion in a film filled with explosions. Even the character of Draco was weakened by this change. In the books, his horror at Crabbe's death was a defining moment. It was the first time he truly understood how fragile his world was. It was the first time he saw that being a Malfoy meant nothing in the face of real danger. By removing that, the film lessened his journey. He was no longer a boy who had lost a friend, but simply a frightened coward who needed to be saved. Crabbe's death in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows was more than just a dramatic moment in the story. It was a lesson in power, in recklessness, in the cost of playing with forces beyond one's understanding. His downfall was his own doing, and that made it all the more tragic. He was not a hero. He was not even a villain. He was a warning. In the aftermath of the battle, when the dust settled and the bodies were counted, no one spoke of Crabbe. No one mourned him. His name was not remembered in the halls of Hogwarts. But his death lingered, a silent reminder of what happens when power is taken too lightly. The flames he had unleashed died down, but their lesson remained. Number 28. The Centaurs joining the battle. The battle had raged for hours, a symphony of spells clashing like thunder across the grounds of Hogwarts. Screams of defiance and agony echoed through the castle walls, and the dark sky above seemed to mourn the fallen. The great hall had been turned into a place of despair, filled with the wounded and the dead. And now, in the heart of the chaos, Lord Voldemort stood before his followers, his pale face contorted into something resembling triumph. He held Harry Potter's limp body in his arms. "He is dead." Voldemort's voice carried across the battlefield, thick with satisfaction. The Death Eaters let out victorious cries, their laughter mingling with the stunned silence of the defenders. The final light of resistance, the hope that had driven them through the night, had been extinguished. Harry Potter was no more. Beyond the castle, just at the tree line of the Forbidden Forest, a silent group watched the scene unfold. Centaurs, powerful, untamed, and wise beyond human understanding, stood motionless, their eyes fixed on the so-called Dark Lord as he relished his victory. They had refused to take part in this war, had resisted aligning themselves with wizards and their endless conflicts. To them, wizards were fools, meddling in powers they barely understood, treating the stars as riddles instead of truth. The Centaurs had always remained neutral, And yet, Ronan's fingers tensed around the wooden frame of his bow. His deep, dark eyes reflected the fires of the castle. Beside him, Bane snorted in agitation, stamping his hoof against the damp earth. The Centaurs were proud, noble creatures, unwilling to be drawn into battles that did not concern them. But this moment, this atrocity, it was beyond mere wizardry. This was not just the folly of men. This was the triumph of evil over all things natural. The Centaurs could feel it in the very air, in the shifting of the heavens. Voldemort had not just killed a boy. He had killed a symbol, a force that had defied the darkness again and again. He had tipped the balance too far, and the Centaurs, watchers of fate, knew that balance must be restored. A breath of wind passed through the trees, rustling the leaves like whispered warnings. The Centaurs exchanged glances, Ronan, Bane, Megorian, Firenze, and the others. A silent understanding passed between them. They did not fight for wizards. They did not fight for Hogwarts, but they would not stand idle while the world fell into the hands of a monster.
Ronan lifted his bow. A single arrow whistled through the night.
The moment it struck its target, one of the Death Eaters on the castle steps, the illusion of Voldemort's inevitable victory shattered like glass. The Death Eater let out a strangled cry before collapsing. The Death Eaters hesitated, momentarily startled. The defenders of Hogwarts, broken and weary, looked up from their grief with wide, disbelieving eyes. Then Bane reared up on his hind legs, his own bowstring drawn taut. Another arrow flew, and then another. The Centaurs charged. Thundering hooves shook the ground as they emerged from the trees, a stampede of wrath and vengeance. The warriors of the Forbidden Forest had made their choice. They were no longer silent spectators. They were part of the fight now. Death Eaters scrambled to retaliate, wands snapping upward, spells erupting from their tips. But the Centaurs were swift. They dodged, weaved, and struck with precision, honed by centuries of survival. Their arrows cut through the air, piercing through dark robes, finding their marks. They wielded their strength like nature's own fury, their hooves shattering bones, their arrows striking down those who had thought themselves untouchable. Voldemort's moment of triumph dissolved in an instant. The battlefield erupted once more, but now the tide was shifting. What had seemed like the dawn of his reign had turned into a war cry against it. The defenders of Hogwarts, those who had knelt in despair only moments ago, found their strength once more. They rose, driven by the sight of their unlikely allies, and they fought with renewed vigor. The battle was not over. Hope was not dead. Somewhere in the chaos, Firenze, the centaur who had once defied his herd to aid Harry, galloped into the fray. His kind had scorned him for helping a human, had shunned him from their ranks, but now they fought side by side. He loosed arrows with deadly accuracy, his heart pounding with something fierce and unyielding. The stars had not spoken of this. The future had been uncertain, the balance in peril. But now the centaurs had taken fate into their own hands. A Death Eater turned toward the charging centaurs, raising his wand, but before he could utter a curse, an arrow embedded itself in his chest. He fell back, eyes wide in shock. Another tried to run, but a centaur's powerful kick sent him flying backward, unconscious before he hit the ground. The battle raged on, and through the din of spells and war cries a new sound rose, the unmistakable, thunderous gallop of hooves.
Voldemort's face twisted in fury. He had not foreseen this. The centaurs were meant to be passive, detached, above the affairs of wizards. And yet here they were, turning the tide against him. He could not control them. He could not threaten them into submission.
The centaurs did not fight for power or for land. They fought because this battle was no longer just about wizards. It was about the order of the world, about stopping a force that sought to consume everything in its path.
And they would not stand idly by.
The Centaurs' charge cut through the ranks of the enemy, breaking their formation, sowing panic among Voldemort's forces. The defenders of Hogwarts pressed forward, emboldened. The Great Hall, moments ago a chamber of mourning, became a stronghold once more. The Dark Lord's victory was slipping through his fingers. Somewhere in the chaos, Neville Longbottom raised the sword of Gryffindor, the boy who had once been overlooked, who had struggled and failed, and yet never given up, found himself at the center of history. With a mighty swing, he severed the head of Nagini, Voldemort's final horcrux. The snake's body hit the ground with a sickening thud.
A scream tore through the night, high and shrill and filled with rage. Voldemort staggered. He was mortal, he was vulnerable, and he was losing.
The Centaurs pressed on, their arrows flying, their hooves striking. They had come as warriors, as forces of nature, as the reckoning Voldemort had not expected. They had stood aside for too long, believing themselves separate from the fate of wizards. But now they fought not for Harry Potter, not for Dumbledore, not for any house of Hogwarts, but for the world itself. And as the final battle reached its climax, as Harry Potter, very much alive, rose to face the Dark Lord one last time, the Centaurs continued their charge. The Forbidden Forest had never seemed darker than in that moment, but the Centaurs, creatures of legend and prophecy, had chosen to stand against the night. Number 29, Voldemort's panic when Harry survived. The clearing in the Forbidden Forest was eerily silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The Death Eaters stood in a tight circle around their master, their eyes filled with dark triumph. Lord Voldemort stood tall at the center, his pale fingers wrapped around the Elder Wand. He had done it. The boy was dead. The battle was over. Harry Potter lay sprawled in the dirt, unmoving. The killing curse had struck him directly, a perfect shot. There should have been nothing left. Voldemort had felt the raw surge of magic leaving his wand, had watched the green flash consume the boy. And yet, something was wrong. A strange sensation pulsed through Voldemort's veins, something foreign, something he had not anticipated. He frowned, his long fingers tightening around the Elder Wand. He felt drained. No, not just drained, unsteady. It was as if something vital had been stripped from him the moment the curse struck Potter. He swayed slightly, but quickly steadied himself. No one must see weakness, not now. Narcissa Malfoy knelt beside the body, her blonde hair brushing against Harry's lifeless form. She placed her hand lightly against his chest, feigning the act of checking for breath. But what she was truly searching for was not life, but her son. When her whispered question came, "Is Draco alive?" and Harry gave the faintest nod in response, her heart slammed against her ribs. She turned her head toward Voldemort and spoke the words he longed to hear.
"He is dead."
A collective murmur of satisfaction rippled through the gathered Death Eaters. They straightened their backs, victorious at last. Some let out quiet laughs, others clenched their fists in triumph. Voldemort lifted his head high, drinking in the moment of his ultimate victory. Harry Potter was dead, the prophecy had failed, the world was his. But the feeling remained, that strange, unsettling wrongness. The Elder Wand was his, the boy was dead. And yet, something inside Voldemort twisted. The moment he had struck Harry, something had been torn from him, something deep, a fracture he could not place. He had not expected this. He had never felt this before. He, the master of death, the ruler of all magic, should not feel weak.
And then the impossible happened.
Harry stirred. It was subtle at first, the faintest twitch of a finger, the breath of a movement barely noticeable. But Voldemort saw it, and for the first time in his life, the Dark Lord felt the creeping fingers of terror tighten around his throat. His red eyes widened, his breath hitched. No, that was not possible. The killing curse did not fail. It was absolute. It had struck Potter straight in the chest. He had watched it happen. He had felt the magic. He had killed him. He had won. And yet the boy moved. Voldemort's fingers tightened so hard around the Elder Wand that his knuckles turned white. A sliver of panic curled in his gut, twisting its way up his spine like a parasite. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. His vision blurred for a fraction of a second, his mind racing in chaotic, disordered thoughts, an unfamiliar sensation for the most powerful dark wizard in history. This was not how it was meant to be. The boy was supposed to be dead. He was supposed to stay dead. Voldemort forced himself to breathe. He had to maintain control. He could not afford weakness in front of his followers. But the fear was there now, clawing at the edges of his carefully constructed confidence. He had never considered the possibility that the killing curse, his killing curse, could fail. He was Lord Voldemort. His power was absolute. And yet, for the first time, doubt bled into his mind. The Death Eaters, oblivious to their master's internal terror, continued to bask in their supposed victory. They jeered, they laughed, they whispered about how Hogwarts had finally fallen. Voldemort barely heard them. His gaze remained locked on Potter's body. Was it a trick? A cruel trick of the light? Had he imagined it? No, he had seen it.
And worse, he had felt it.
His own magic had recoiled. The Elder Wand, a sickening realization gripped him, suffocating in its horror. The wand had not obeyed him. It had worked, but not as it should have. His greatest weapon, the tool that should have made him invincible, had betrayed him. His breathing became shallow. He could not show them, could not let them see that for the first time in decades, Lord Voldemort felt powerless. Then came the scream. Hagrid's voice, raw with grief, tore through the night air.
No, Harry!
The half-giant fought against his chains, the grief in his cries shaking even the coldest of hearts. The sound sent a fresh wave of unease through Voldemort's body. He was standing in the center of his victory, surrounded by devoted followers, yet he had never felt so exposed.
Something was wrong.
He had to silence the panic clawing at his ribs. He was still the greatest sorcerer to ever live. He had defeated death itself. He had conquered the world.
Hadn't he?
And then, as if the universe itself had heard his silent terror, Harry moved again. A quiet gasp rippled through the forest. Some of the Death Eaters turned their heads slightly, sensing a disturbance, but not yet understanding what their master had already realized.
Harry was alive. Voldemort staggered back. It was barely noticeable, just the faintest movement, but it betrayed everything. He caught himself, forcing his body to stillness, but it was too late. The fear had already rooted itself in him. Harry sat up.
The Dark Lord's vision pulsed. This was not happening. It was impossible. The Elder Wand, the Death Stick, the most powerful wand in existence, it should have obeyed him. It should have been his.
But it wasn't.
Harry was alive because the wand had never truly belonged to Voldemort. It had belonged to Draco Malfoy. And then it had passed, without anyone realizing it, to Harry himself.
Voldemort was holding a weapon that refused to kill its true master.
The Dark Lord's breath became shallow. His red eyes darted from Harry to the wand in his own hand, as if seeing it for the first time. His fingers clenched, and he willed it to obey him. Nothing happened. For the first time since his return, Voldemort felt something he did not understand. He felt mortal. The realization shattered him. For years he had convinced himself that he had ascended beyond the realm of death, that he had conquered fate, that he had become something more than human. And yet here he stood, his greatest spell rejected, his greatest weapon useless. He was not a god. He was not untouchable. He was a man who had ripped apart his own soul, believing it would make him immortal. And now he saw the truth. Harry Potter was rising to his feet, and the look in his eyes was not one of fear. It was not one of submission. It was the look of someone who knew how this battle would end. The panic in Voldemort's chest burned now. It spread like wildfire, tightening his throat, forcing his pulse to race. He clenched the Elder Wand, willing it to listen, willing it to obey. But the truth was already clear.
He had lost.
And for the first time in his life, Lord Voldemort knew what it meant to be afraid. Number 30, Harry ransacking Dumbledore's office in anger. The rage came like a wave, swallowing him whole before he could even think. It wasn't just sadness, nor was it mere frustration. It was an overwhelming, uncontrollable storm inside him, a storm that had been building for years, every loss, every failure, every injustice, all compounding into one searing moment of devastation. And then it snapped. Harry had sprinted through the corridors of Hogwarts, his chest heaving, his breath coming in gasps that were closer to sobs, his fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. He barely registered the students he shoved past, their faces blurred and insignificant. There was only one destination in his mind, the office of Albus Dumbledore. The stone gargoyle guarding the entrance to the headmaster's office hadn't even finished moving aside before Harry pushed his way through, throwing himself up the spiral staircase. His fury burned hotter with every step until he reached the heavy wooden door and burst inside without knocking. Dumbledore was already standing as if he had been expecting him. His blue eyes, usually so full of wisdom and mystery, were solemn now, sorrowful. He did not speak, did not raise a hand in greeting or warning. He simply stood and watched. The moment Harry saw him, the dam inside him broke.
"He's gone!" Harry roared, his voice raw, cracking with pain. His chest rose and fell erratically as his entire body trembled. "He's gone and you did nothing!"
His hand shot out, grabbing the nearest object, a delicate silver instrument that had once whirred and spun with quiet magic. Now it shattered against the stone wall, pieces flying in every direction. Dumbledore did not flinch.
Harry's breathing turned into a snarl. His hands reached for another object, an inkwell this time, heavy and filled to the brim with black ink. He hurled it with all his strength, watching with vicious satisfaction as it exploded against the bookshelf, dark ink splattering across centuries-old tomes. "I trusted you," he bellowed, his voice growing hoarse. "I trusted you to keep him safe, to keep all of us safe."
Another object crashed, a chair overturned. His knuckles scraped against wood as he slammed his fists into the desk, sending papers fluttering to the floor. The portraits on the walls gasped and protested, some scurrying to the edges of their frames in an attempt to avoid the destruction.
"You knew!" Harry spat, his green eyes burning with grief, locked onto Dumbledore's. "You knew this was coming. You knew about the prophecy. You knew I had to face him, didn't you?"
Dumbledore remained silent. Something inside Harry twisted painfully at the lack of response. He wanted a fight. He wanted to see anger on Dumbledore's face, to be told he was wrong, to be given some sort of excuse that might dull the pain crushing his chest. But there was nothing. The silence was worse than shouting.
"Answer me!" Harry screamed, grabbing a silver contraption from the desk and throwing it with all his might. It bounced off the wall and hit the floor with a metallic clang.
Still Dumbledore did nothing. Harry's vision blurred, his entire body ached, his fingers curled and uncurled as if they didn't know whether to punch or collapse. He could barely stand, the weight of his own grief pressing down on him with unbearable force. For a split second, he considered stopping. He had wrecked half the office already. Papers were scattered, books were overturned, broken glass littered the floor. But the rage still simmered beneath his skin, pulsing like a second heartbeat. Sirius was gone. The man who had been the closest thing to a father, his escape from the Dursleys, his one true hope for a family, was gone forever. Taken from him in a cruel, irreversible instant. His chest clenched so painfully he thought he might break. His hands found Dumbledore's desk again, and he clutched its edge as though it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. "I should have saved him," he whispered, the words tasting like acid in his mouth. "I should have done something." At last Dumbledore moved.
Not to stop him, not to reprimand him, just a single step forward. "You are not to blame," the headmaster said quietly.
Harry's throat burned. He let out a ragged breath, shaking his head violently. "Don't!" he choked. "Don't tell me that!"
"It is the truth."
Harry laughed bitterly, the sound devoid of any real amusement. "You always say that, don't you? That things happen for a reason, that there's some grand plan." His eyes burned. "Well, I don't care. I don't care about prophecies or fates or what's supposed to happen. He's gone and he's not coming back." The words felt final. He hadn't said them out loud before now, hadn't truly admitted it, but the weight of them hit him like a sledgehammer.
Sirius was dead, gone, irrevocably, permanently gone.
His knees nearly buckled. The energy drained from his limbs so suddenly that he had to clutch at the desk to keep from collapsing. His breathing came in short, sharp gasps. Dumbledore remained silent, letting the words hang in the air like a funeral bell. The office, once filled with destruction and rage, now felt oppressively quiet. Harry swallowed thickly. His eyes flickered to the mess around him, to the shards of glass, the broken instruments, the ruined books. He had wanted to destroy something, anything to make the pain inside him feel tangible. And he had, but it hadn't helped. His fists unclenched slowly, his arms felt impossibly heavy, his shoulders slumped. He turned his gaze back to Dumbledore. "Why didn't you stop me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dumbledore regarded him for a long moment before finally speaking. "Because grief must be felt," he said, "must be given a voice." Harry exhaled shakily, dragging a hand over his face. His anger was spent, leaving only exhaustion and an unbearable hollowness in its wake. He wanted to scream again, to demand why it had to be Sirius, why it always had to be the people he loved who were taken from him. But no words came. Dumbledore moved slowly, stepping around the wreckage until he was standing closer. "I never wished this pain upon you, Harry," he said softly. "And I know my silence must feel like a betrayal. But I ask you to believe this. There are answers. And when you are ready to hear them, I will tell you everything." Harry's jaw tensed, his fingers curled slightly at his sides, but he nodded, because no matter how much he hated it, how much he wished he could turn back time and change everything, he knew that what Dumbledore was offering was the only thing he had left. Truth. It wouldn't bring Sirius back, it wouldn't erase the past, but maybe, just maybe, it could give him something to hold on to. As he turned away, stepping carefully over the mess he had made, he knew one thing for certain. He would never be the same again. Number 31, Hermione erasing her parents' memories. The house was silent. The warm glow of the afternoon sun spilled through the windows, casting long golden streaks on the wooden floor. It was a house filled with love, with laughter, with the echoes of a childhood nurtured in the embrace of two devoted parents. But by the time Hermione Granger walked out of that door, the home would be different. It would be missing something, someone. She stood in the living room, heart pounding, hands trembling, as she gripped her wand. The walls were adorned with photographs, frozen moments of happiness. There was a picture of her, grinning with missing front teeth, taken when she had lost her first tooth. Another of her holding up her Hogwarts letter with wide, excited eyes. A family vacation at the beach, her parents smiling, arms around their only Aortef. Hermione had always been logical, always practical, but nothing in her life had prepared her for this. There was no spell in any book that could take away the ache in her heart, no charm to erase the guilt weighing her down. Yet she knew it had to be done. She had spent the last few weeks obsessing over the details. The war was coming. Voldemort's Death Eaters would stop at nothing to get to her, to get to Harry. And if they couldn't find her, they would look for her family. Muggleborns were already being hunted. People were disappearing, tortured, killed. Hermione had seen what Bellatrix Lestrange did to the Longbottoms. She couldn't let that happen to her parents. She had researched the spell carefully. Obliviate was irreversible. Unlike ordinary memory charms, which could sometimes be broken or undone, this would be absolute. She wasn't just making them forget a single event. She was wiping herself from their lives entirely. They wouldn't remember ever having a daughter. She had practiced on objects, on old photos, on memories of schoolwork she no longer needed. But none of it could prepare her for the reality of erasing herself from the two people who had loved her more than anything. She took a shuddering breath. It was time. Her parents, Wendell and Monica Granger, sat on the couch watching television, completely unaware that their daughter was about to vanish from their lives forever. She raised her wand, swallowing the lump in her throat.
"I'm sorry," she whispered. Then with a precise flick she murmured, "Obliviate."
The change was instant. The warmth in their eyes faded. The familiar, affectionate recognition was gone. They blinked in confusion. Hermione knew what would happen next. She had prepared for this. The spell had rewritten their memories. They would soon decide to move, to start a new life in Australia, a life where they had never had a daughter. Her father turned to her with a puzzled expression. "Oh, hello, can I help you with something?" Her breath caught in her throat. She had expected it. She had planned for it. But it still shattered her.
"No, I was just—" She forced herself to smile, backing toward the door. "I was just leaving."
And she did. She left before her voice could break, before she could collapse under the weight of what she had done. Outside, she stood on the doorstep for a long time, staring at the house that had been her childhood home. A home where she had been loved, cherished, protected. A home that no longer belonged to her. She could see them through the window, moving about as if nothing had changed, as if she had never existed. Hermione had always believed that knowledge was power, that intelligence could solve any problem. But in this moment, she had never felt more powerless. She walked away, gripping her wand so tightly her knuckles turned white. She would never be able to tell them the truth, never be able to bring them back, and they would never come looking for her. The books didn't shy away from the weight of this decision. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the moment is brief but deeply haunting. I've also modified my parents' memories so that they're convinced they're really called Wendell and Monica Wilkins, and that their life's ambition is to move to Australia, which they have now done. Simple words, but beneath them was a sacrifice so immense that few could comprehend it. Hermione was not just the brightest witch of her age. She was the most selfless. She was willing to become a stranger to the two people who had loved her unconditionally. The films, however, barely scratched the surface. The scene was visually stunning. Hermione standing in the dim light, erasing herself from photographs. But it lacked the brutal finality of the books. It didn't fully capture the fact that she was making herself a ghost in her own family. In the books, the tragedy lingers. She does not dwell on it, but it is always there, hanging over her. Even in moments of triumph, she cannot share it with them. When the war ended, when Voldemort was defeated, Harry had the chance to go home. Ron had a family to embrace. But Hermione? She had nothing to return to.
Even if she could find her parents again, even if she could track them down in Australia, what then? Could she restore what she had erased? Could she walk up to them, tell them the truth, and expect them to understand?
Would they forgive her for making them forget? She had done it to protect them, to save them from the horror of being the parents of a Muggle born in a world where Voldemort was hunting people like her. But what if she had just abandoned them? This question haunted her. Even after the war, even as they sat in the ruins of Hogwarts, Hermione carried this weight alone. There was no spell to fix this, no counter-curse. The grief of it was quiet, subtle, but always there. Years later, as she sat with Ron, watching the next generation board the Hogwarts Express, she wondered, did they ever feel like something was missing? A name they couldn't quite recall? A face that flickered in the back of their minds? Or were they truly happy in their new life, in a world where Hermione Jean Granger had never existed? Perhaps that was the real tragedy.
Not that she had erased herself.